There are places in this world untouched by time, places where the air carries the scent of old earth, hay, and pine, and where hard work is woven into the land like roots beneath the soil. Jacob Holton's farm was one of those places. Tucked deep in the quiet valley of Ironwood County, miles from the nearest interstate, it was more than land. It was legacy. 3 generations of Holtons had worked the soil here, raising cattle, baling hay, and hauling timber from the surrounding woods since long before the first neighbor moved in. Jacob came from a line of men who believed in honor, land, and silence. People of this valley said more with their hands than their mouths. For decades, there had been no conflict here, no drama, no war over fences, fields, or water. The people of Ironwood minded their own business, until progress clawed its way into the valley disguised as opportunity. The town council sold off a stretch of valley land to developers who carved it into neat suburban lots and advertised it as Riverview Meadows, country living for modern families. But the newcomers who poured in from the city were not farmers, ranchers, or homesteaders. They were people who wanted the beauty of the country without respecting the land they moved into. And they brought rules, committees, regulations. They brought the thing Jacob never thought would reach Ironwood. They brought an HOA. First came the complaints. Jacob's tractor made too much noise. His cows smelled unpleasant. The rooster crowed too early in the morning. His barn, built by his grandfather, was labeled unsightly. He had watched it all quietly, venturing into town less and less, doing his best to ignore the chaos spreading just beyond his boundary lines. The HOA controlled the new subdivision, not him. He had no interest in their board, their fees, or their flimsy attempts at controlling a land they did not understand. He was not a part of their world, nor did he want to be. But they wanted him gone. The first letter they mailed was politely hostile. The second was less polite. The third was a threat. Each was signed by Marjorie Kellerman, HOA president and self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards. She had lived in Ironwood all of 15 months and somehow believed she could dictate what was, or wasn't, acceptable in a town older than her entire bloodline. Jacob ignored her, but she didn't ignore him. It began small. A broken fence post near the cattle pasture, a cut electric line to his barn, tire tracks near his fields late at night. He replaced what they sabotaged, strengthened what they tampered with. He told himself it would pass, that people like them always needed something to complain about, that eventually they would find someone new to target. He was wrong. The attack came not as vandalism or trespassing, but through something far more sinister. Something meant to cause harm that could not be undone. Something that threatened not just his land, but his life on it. Jacob first noticed something was wrong with the water when he went to draw a bucket from the old stone well behind the farmhouse. The bucket came up with water that smelled off, metallic, bitter, the kind of taste that sends a warning before the mind understands why. He poured it out, assuming maybe a raccoon or squirrel had fallen into the shaft, but when he lowered a light inside, he saw nothing unusual. The next morning, he tried again. The water was worse, milky, greasy, almost oily. His stomach tightened. This wasn't natural. Something was in the well. He did what any farmer would. He protected what mattered. He shut off the pump to the well that supplied his lines and stopped the cattle from drinking. He resorted to stored rain barrels for now. Then he sent samples of the water to be tested. Jacob didn't wait for results. He had lived long enough around dangerous people to know when he had been attacked. Someone wanted him out, and someone had escalated the fight. Unlike them, he didn't panic. He didn't rant, rage, or knock on doors. He let them believe he hadn't noticed. He continued working the farm as normal. He made himself predictable, weak, vulnerable, someone they would underestimate. That was how he wanted it. The test results arrived 2 days later. The water was laced with industrial pesticide, one that was banned in most states, highly toxic, dangerous even to livestock. It wasn't an accident. Someone had carried that poison by hand, walked to his well in the dead of night, and dumped it inside. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Only one question remained. Who? It could have been any of the HOA loyalists who had harassed him. A dozen names came to mind. Men who liked to drive past his fence just to glare. Women who whispered about him at town hall meetings. Teenagers who threw beer bottles at his mailbox. But this wasn't a prank. This was deliberate, personal, coordinated. Jacob investigated alone. No police, no sheriff, not yet. He walked the land at sunrise and sunset. He inspected the well house roof, the ground around it, the barn, and the connecting paths. He searched for evidence, not the kind of evidence a city detective would look for, but the kind a landowner understands. Footsteps, tool marks, grass disturbances, broken branches, tire ruts. And he found them, a flat trail through the weeds near the back of his property. Someone had driven close enough to access the well, but not so close as to leave tracks on the open road. He followed the faint impressions until they disappeared across a property line. Those tracks led in only one direction, toward the subdivision, toward Riverview Meadows, toward the HOA. Still, accusation without proof was nothing in this kind of war, especially not against people who hid behind committees and policies and neighborhood watch meetings. People who used polite manners and fake smiles like camouflage. Evidence. That was the only weapon he would use. He set hidden cameras, motion lights, tripwire alarms, and he waited. Jacob didn't have much family left. No wife, no children. His only loyalties were to his land, his cattle, and the quiet he worked so hard to preserve. He didn't care for confrontation. But this attack crossed a line. Water was life out here. A poisoned well was a death sentence. The trespassers had brought violence to his doorstep. They had declared war, and whether they knew it or not, they had started a fight they could never win. Because what no one in Riverview Meadows knew, what the HOA couldn't possibly imagine, was that Jacob wasn't just a farmer. He was the legal owner of something far more valuable than a quiet piece of land. He had something no one else had, something that gave him leverage over every living soul in Ironwood County. He owned the river, not the water that ran through it, no, that was public, but the water rights, the legal authority to divert, restrict, or repurpose the flow. A silent inheritance passed from his great-grandfather, who had filed the claim over a century ago. Back then, the river had been key for steam mills and logging operations. But now, it was everything. It fed the town reservoir, it supplied Riverview Meadows, and most importantly, it was the last reliable water source in the valley. The HOA believed they had cornered a man with nothing. But they had just picked a fight with the one person who controlled everything they took for granted. And soon, they would learn what that meant. Because Jacob Holton wasn't going to sue, or argue, or beg for justice. He was going to teach them fear. And it would begin with water. Days passed in silence, but the land felt different now, infected by the violation that had seeped into Jacob's well. A farm is a living thing, and Jacob had always felt the pulse of his land beneath his boots. But now there was a different rhythm, an unease, a disturbance. The animals sensed it too. The cattle had grown restless near dusk, and even the old hound, that slept by the porch, seemed to wake suddenly at night, growling at things unseen. The poison had worked its damage long before he discovered it. 3 calves had fallen sick from drinking before he shut down the well system, and 2 had already died. The loss weighed on him, carved into him like a blade. Cattle were money, yes, but these animals were also part of his blood. He had raised them, fed them, protected them from storms and wolves and winter itself. But he hadn't been able to protect them from the worst predator of all, mankind with malice. He didn't bury those calves right away. He had another purpose for them: proof. Evidence that someone had tried to kill what he owned. He stored their bodies in an old walk-in cooler behind the barn, preserving what he could until he knew what to do with it. Revenge, like harvest, required timing. The trail he had followed in the grass had faded after a day of wind, but he knew exactly where it had led, toward the development. Riverview Meadows sat like a parasite latched onto the hills, a grid of identical plastic houses with perfect yards, smiling porches, and hollow souls. Every house looked the same. Every life inside those walls probably did too. Jacob understood that in order to win, he needed more than anger. He needed names, motive, proof. And to get that, he had to enter enemy territory. He drove his old truck into town one quiet afternoon under the guise of running feed supplies. The hardware store sat at the edge of Main Street, a place where news passed faster than the wind through the corn. People talked in small towns, but only if you knew how to listen. He gathered what he needed: trail cameras, trip alarms, water test kits, replacement locks, and heavy-duty chain. He paid in cash. He carried everything himself. He kept his head low. The cashier, a man who had known Jacob since they were both boys, asked no questions. But he watched the purchase with a flicker of understanding. Word of the poison would spread soon. But not yet. Jacob would control the story. By dusk that night, the real work began. He moved like a ghost across his own land, installing the hidden cameras strategically, near the well, along the perimeter fence, near the dirt access road that curved along the tree line. He threaded the trip alarms through brush, masked them with leaves, and camouflaged them under soil. Anything crossing into his property now would leave a trace, or trigger a reaction. The motion sensors were rigged to small alert buzzers he placed in his bedroom, barn, and workshop. No matter where he was, he would know if someone came near the well again. Whether it was one person or a group, he would catch them. But he knew cameras only caught people after they made a move. He needed to get inside before they struck again. He needed to know who was behind this. He spent the next day studying the HOA from a distance, not as a reckless man seeking vengeance, but as a hunter studying prey. He learned that Riverview Meadows held HOA meetings every Sunday evening inside the clubhouse. Attendance was mandatory for residents, but technically open to community members by request. He knew they wouldn't invite him. He wasn't one of them. But going in person wasn't his goal, not yet. He drove his truck to the hill overlooking the clubhouse and watched from the ridge through binoculars. He counted faces. He memorized cars. He studied license plates. He noted who shook hands, who whispered in corners, who carried themselves with the arrogance of authority. Marjorie Kellerman, the HOA president, ran the meetings like a tyrant in pearls. She was flanked by her allies, people who loved control more than community. The board members were predictable. The vice president, Rodney Pierce, a smug real estate broker had sold half the neighborhood overpriced lots. The treasurer, June Carson, whose favorite hobby was collecting fines. The secretary, Elliot Granger, who kept files on everyone and believed rules were more important than people. One of these people, or all of them, had ordered the attack on Jacob. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed proof. He needed a confession, caught not in words, but in motion. He needed them to act again. And they would, because people like that couldn't stop themselves. Power was a hunger. Greed was a sickness. They wanted Jacob gone, and they would come back to finish what they started. Night fell, and with it came the first sign of movement. One of the trip alarms buzzed at midnight. Then another. Jacob didn't turn on any lights. He moved silently, grabbing his coat, hat, and rifle, not to use, but to carry. He wasn't going to kill anyone, not yet. But he would be ready. He stepped off the porch, letting his eyes adjust to the moonlight. He could see the shadows moving near the edge of the property, 2 of them. They weren't stealthy. They had flashlights, but they kept them low to avoid being seen from a distance. He followed them, circling wide, staying downwind to avoid detection. He kept low in the tall grass until he reached an old maple tree at the edge of the field. He raised the binoculars. 2 men. He didn't recognize them, but they moved with a purpose. Not vandals, not kids. They knew where they were going. They headed straight for the well. Jacob studied every move they made. One carried a jug, the other carried a funnel. Rage pulsed inside him like fire under steel, but he didn't move. If he attacked now, he would scare them into hiding. Instead, he let them act. Let them hang themselves with evidence. The hidden cameras captured everything. Their faces, their actions, their vehicle parked down the dirt road beyond the trees. It was perfect. Once they finished, they turned and hurried back down the path. They were amateurs. They thought darkness made them invisible. But they had no idea what hunted them now. He tracked them from a distance, memorizing the route their tires took. He followed just long enough to watch them disappear into the subdivision, into Riverview Meadows. And though he couldn't see which house they entered, he saw who was waiting outside to meet them. A woman stood there in a long coat, arms crossed, watching them arrive. Even at night, he recognized her silhouette. He had seen it on posters around town, the smiling face of Marjorie Kellerman, HOA president. She had sent them. Now he had proof. But justice would not be found in police reports or courtrooms. People like her knew how to manipulate systems and twist laws into weapons. No, she would not be beaten on paper. She would be crushed by the land itself. Jacob returned to his farm before sunrise. He cleaned his boots, stored the rifle, checked the footage, saved it to 3 hidden drives. Then he locked the well with a heavy iron grate so no one could reach it again. Any future attempts would be impossible, or fatal for whoever tried. He knew what came next. He poured himself a cup of rainwater. The cattle watched him in silence as he looked across the land. The time for defense was over. The time for retaliation had begun. And before this was over, every last member of that HOA would know. He did not need their water, but they needed his. Jacob Holton had lived a lifetime making things work with what the land offered. He understood channels and currents the way some men understood the turn of a wrench or the torque of an engine. Water didn't just flow for him. It answered. It listened. It had been coaxed and channeled by his family for 100 years. Stone flumes, hand-dug diversion ditches, a creeping system of weirs and sluice gates that once fed the steam engines of timber mills and now watered fields and refilled cisterns. The river had been his ancestors' lifeline, and its rights were inked in a brittle, near-fee, Orgotten deed lodged in the county clerk's stacks. That deed was a relic to some, but to Jacob it was a tool waiting to be used. He spent the morning in the old farmhouse study pulling the deed out of its cedar box. The paper crinkled with age, but the language was clear. Exclusive riparian rights to divert water from the South Fork of Ironwood River for irrigation and domestic use within specified bounds. It meant he had more legal muscle than any HOA checklist could muster. Whoever had assumed they could push him out had miscalculated the way inheritance and law could be weaponized when held by someone who knew how to move like water. Jacob didn't gloat. He planned. He pulled maps from drawers, laid them on the table, and traced the river's course with a calloused finger. He noted every culvert, every sluice, every channel that fed the town reservoir, and, further downstream, the man-made catch basin that supplied Riverview Meadows. The development's manicured lawns and sprinkler systems had no idea how dependent they were on the old flume that threaded through the Holton property. Those sprinklers were delicate, modern, entitlement-fueled appendages. Cut the source, and their little Eden would show its bones. But he refused to be petty. His aim was not to destroy lives. He wanted justice, deterrence, and to make the covetous understand the fragility of what they had taken for granted. He wanted them to feel the consequence of poisoning his water and slaughtering his calves. He wanted them to know that a life built on someone else's ruin was built on sand. He called no lawyer. He called no sheriff. Instead, he went to the people who still understood how rivers were moved. Old friends, neighbors, men whose names still showed on the plowshares and worn hats scattered across county land. They weren't a mob. They were a network of stewards who respected the way water and soil worked. He spoke quietly, and the response was immediate. An old logger with a skidder, a retired county engineer who still had plans for drainage ditches tucked in his truck, and two ranchers, with pickups and chains. They came not because Jacob asked for revenge, but because they understood betrayal. The poisoned well was an affront to every hand that had worked these hills. They met out by the river at dusk, when the light was honest and the mosquitoes thick. Jacob laid out the plan, a temporary, legal diversion of the South Fork into the Holton irrigation flume for the period the deed allowed. The flume had been designed to carry water. It needed no more than a cleared intake and a set of boards to shift the flow. No dynamite, no showy destruction. Just rerouting what rightfully could be routed. He wanted two things at once: to stop the flow to the town basin and to create visible, undeniable scarcity in Riverview Meadows. The retired engineer, Tom, a man with oil-stained fingers and a memory full of culverts, approved quietly. "You do it right," he said in his way. "You do it clean." They would do it clean. They would show the town that necessity was not cruelty. The first night they worked under a boiled sky, using lanterns and muscle. They moved pipes, clamped gates, and shifted boards like modern-day river shepherds. Jacob guided the placement, directing each man with the economy of gesture accrued from decades of labor. The skidder pulled a rusted sheet of guardrail into place upstream to focus the current. The engineer measured angles and flow, making sure the new line could handle summer runoff without breaking the law that bound him. The ranchers dug a shallow channel where water could be coaxed into the flume without draining the marshes that fed the valley's wildlife. They finished near dawn, bone-tired and covered in mud. The river answered like an old animal obeying a call. A subtle change occurred, not a roar, but an altered breath. The mouth of the South Fork nudged slightly toward the new board, found the gap, and began its slow migration in to the Holton flume. It was a whisper at first, then a stronger current pulling away from the town basin. Jacob sat on the bank and listened to the new sound, water being claimed again. He felt it, in his chest, like victory, but tempered it with the memory of the calves. He had not wanted this. He had been forced into it. Still, he knew this step would wake the valley. It would send river smoke up through Ridgeline Road and force the HOA to taste dryness. When the sun rose, Riverview Meadows woke to a different reality. The town basin that supplied sprinklers and automatic lawn irrigation was a hairline thinner than the day before. Neighborhood kids discovered brown patches spreading across once green lawns. The HOA servers flagged a cascade of complaints: brown blades, dead shrubs, sputtering fountains. The board convened an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Marjorie Kellerman ordered the landscapers to run extra trucks. The treasurer demanded immediate expenditure, and the vice president called the county. They called the county because they did not yet understand cause and effect. They called because their perfect lives required external sanction, permission from authorities to be saved. But rescue would not come fast enough. The county's bureaucracy moved at its own pace, which by design is glacial. That was part of Jacob's calculation. Meanwhile, Jacob worked a second front. He would not simply cut water. He would also reveal the poisoning. He could throw the entire scheme into sharp public focus by connecting the sabotage to Marjorie and her cronies. The footage he had captured of the men with the jugs, men who had returned under the cover of night, was solid. He had their faces, their vehicle, and the location where they parked. He set to work enhancing the footage, compiling a timeline. The poison dropped into his well, the calves sickened and died, the men returned to the subdivision. Marjorie met them there. It was a story with a spine. But stories live or die on presentation. Jacob knew how the town's pulse worked. Rumor churned in barbershops and coffees. Beelines and a paper headline could set the whole valley ablaze. He made copies of the footage and slipped them discreetly to trusted hands. The hardware cashier who knew news before it hit the street, a local radio host who still valued truth over advertisers, the retired sheriff who had not been bought by the subdivision's money. He wanted the story to breathe, to feel inevitable. By the second day, the story was half, whispered in grocery aisles, poisoned wells, dead calves, the HOA's pet project under suspicion. The third day, a small online forum posted low-resolution clips and questioned whether the HOA had something to hide. The fourth day, the HOA held another emergency meeting, this time fraught with panic and thin-faced anger. They demanded the County Act. They demanded the Holtons be forced to open their flume. Marjorie stormed into the scene like a queen betrayed. Her pearls clacked, her nails were immaculate, and her voice, always precise, sounded smaller in the face of a real crisis. She issued orders, she placed calls, she made threats. The subdivision's landscapers revved trucks, but water was not magic. It came from a source, and that source had found a new route. When the first tanker trucks arrived to shuttle water into the neighborhood, they were a PR move, Band-Aids for a larger wound. The homeowners posted photos of hoses and buckets, but the optics stung. The images of kids drawing water from bottled jugs and sprinklers sputtering on brown lawns made the narrative clear. The new residents had moved to the country for pastoral beauty, but they had discovered a vulnerability their planners had not accounted for: dependence. They were as fragile as any house of cards. At dusk, as tanker engines rumbled down Main Street and cameras gathered at the clubhouse, Jacob stood alone by the river and watched the gradually emptying basin downstream. He did no cheer. The satisfaction he felt was tempered by a deeper sorrow. This valley had been his family's forever. He never wanted to make it a battleground. But he would not be forced. The embers glowed like small warnings. Tomorrow would be loud. The HOA would push back. Lawyers, press conferences, threats of injunctions. They had money to throw at problems. But money could not buy the knowledge Jacob possessed. How to bend a river without destroying it. How to make scarcity reveal character. How to move through the world with the patience of water. He had opened a door. On the other side stood the herd of consequences he had set in motion. He would not close it now. Conflict has a sound. It isn't shouting. It isn't violence or noise. It's tension. The silent tightening of a rope just before it snaps. When the convoy of HOA vehicles rolled down the gravel road toward Jacob Holton's farm, the sound of conflict was already in the air. The dust from their tires drifted behind them like a warning cloud, and their shining SUVs cut across farmland like chrome scars. They had arrived to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Jacob stood waiting. He stood not with a weapon, not with a mob, but with calm purpose, and a ledger of quiet vengeance already unfolding. The land beside him spoke on his behalf, fields watered, cattle alive, a working farm untouched by drought. In stark contradiction, just a few miles away, Riverview Meadows was drying out like grass in a furnace. The HOA called their emergency visit a negotiation, but Jacob knew what it was, a confrontation disguised in polite aggression. He watched from a distance as they gathered, dressed for battle in polished appearances, blazers over pressed shirts, neat hair, bitter expressions. Marjorie Kellerman led them, flanked by her board members Rodney Pierce and June Carson. Behind them followed a handful of residents, their fear buried beneath frustration. They scanned the property as though stepping into enemy territory. To them, Jacob was not a neighbor. They had cast him as an obstacle, a relic, a man in the way of progress. They still believed this fight was about a single farmer refusing to bend. They didn't yet understand the scale of what had been set in motion. They had no idea they were fighting water rights. They had no idea he was in control of the only river that fed their cushioned lives. By the time they reached Jacob, their anger was no longer hidden. Their carefully structured order had cracked. Lawns were dying, gardens were failing. Swimming pools had been shut down to preserve residential supply. Worse, local news had picked up the controversy. Headlines began circulating online. HOA water crisis linked to rural property dispute, residents outraged as water sources shrink. People started asking questions, and the HOA feared questions more than drought itself. The confrontation that unfolded on that dusty afternoon would have seemed small to someone driving by. There were no police, no shouting crowds, no violence. But in the silence between Jacob and the HOA board, battle lines were set. He said nothing, but the message was clear. The river diversion was legal. The deed was binding. And Riverview Meadows, despite its expensive layouts and smug artificial prestige, could do nothing without his consent. Water obeyed land rights, not entitlement. The HOA tried to intimidate him with threats of court orders. He did not respond. They tried to shame him by blaming him for the suffering of families. He did not bend. They accused him of cruelty. He did not move. Behind his silence, the river flowed, not for them, but for him alone, and this was only the beginning. They left in frustration, swearing retaliation, and they followed through. Within days, Marjorie placed injunction after injunction through county channels, attempting to challenge his inherited water rights. Legal papers arrived by courier, letters from attorneys, demands, warnings. Yet none of it held. The deed survived every attack. The law was clear, carved in history long before their subdivision existed, so they escalated. First, they attacked rumor. Accusations spread through HOA newsletters and town message boards. They painted Jacob as unhinged, vindictive, paranoid. They claimed he poisoned himself to frame them. They called him dangerous. They said his land was a threat to community safety. They called for his property to be investigated by environmental agencies. It was a typical tactic of control: isolate, vilify, destroy. It didn't work. Then came their desperation. Riverview Meadows was dying faster than they had predicted. Brown grass turned to dust. Gardens rotted in place. Homeowners, once proud of their pristine lawns and perfect hedges, now fought over rationed water like scavengers. Lawn companies shut down contracts. Landscaping crews demanded refunds they would never receive. Children carried bottled water to school. Tempers turned neighbor against neighbor. But Jacob wasn't finished. He would not strike once. He would strike until they understood. Late one night, he opened the second gate. The river had more than one artery feeding the town basin, and Jacob controlled them all. The diversion he had created so far was just a taste of what he could do. By adjusting the sluice gates and opening additional flumes, he could slow the river to a mere trickle before it reached their pumps. He waited until the dead of night, then returned to the river with Tom and two trusted ranchers. They removed the final boards holding back the water from his old logging channels. The river obeyed. Its new route flowed deeper into his land, branching into irrigation ditches, pooling into cisterns, feeding his farm and those who had stood by him. By contrast, Riverview Meadows woke to silence. No sprinklers, no hoses, no fountains. The pressure in their water lines had fallen to nearly zero. Faucets sputtered and died. Toilets stopped refilling. The HOA emergency line crashed under the volume of calls. Fear had arrived, and fear made people remember truth. The same residents who had once called Jacob's farm ugly now drove past it slowly, staring at green fields they could not imitate, at livestock drinking from water troughs while their own gardens turned to ash. Many of them rolled down windows, staring in disbelief. Some looked angry. Others looked ashamed. Some were thinking, maybe for the first time in their lives. Some were realizing that they had moved into land controlled by men and women long before them. Men like Jacob, who did not measure wealth in status or property value, but in resilience. Farmers and ranchers do not play at power. They build it. And now, they wielded it. Tension escalated, but Jacob did not flinch. He reinforced his land. He reinforced the river. He reinforced the truth. Evidence was moving through the county now. The story of his poisoned well had broken beyond rumor. Photos of the poisoned water samples and footage of cars arriving at his property had leaked online. Local news stories became regional. The sheriff was now under pressure to investigate what was being called intentional agricultural sabotage, a felony. Suddenly, Marjorie Kellerman was nowhere to be seen in public. The board members had stopped posting HOA newsletters. Rodney Pierce scrubbed his social media. June Carson sent desperate emails to county officials begging for intervention. They believed they were losing control. They were right. But Jacob wasn't done. He had cut their water. He had exposed their crime. Now he would break their empire. He would take their power, not with violence, but with truth. And the truth was something that, once unleashed, no HOA could regulate, censor, or silence. Because truth, like water, always found a way. And he was going to let it flood the valley. The drought wasn't just in the land now, it was in the people. Thirst made tempers fragile. Feed made people dangerous. And Jacob Holton knew this chapter of the fight wouldn't be won with fences or water rights. It would be won with truth. Because truth, when revealed at the right time, isn't a weapon, it's a detonation. The breaking point. 4 days after Jacob opened the second gate, Riverview Meadows reached panic level. The HOA emergency hotline was overwhelmed. Residents stood in their driveways angrily holding buckets, arguing over who took too long at the community water station. Tempers exploded in neighborhood group chats. Police were called 3 times in 24 hours due to fights over water hoarding. Marjorie Kellerman, the HOA president, tried to contain the chaos by sending a community-wide email titled, "Temporary Water Inconvenience. Stay calm." But screenshots leaked immediately. People laughed at the phrase inconvenience while their kids couldn't shower and their lawns were dead. Behind closed doors, the HOA board panicked. They knew Jacob had the legal upper hand, and if his public poisoning accusation gained traction, they wouldn't just lose their reputation. They'd face prison. So they came up with a plan, and they made a mistake. Because someone inside the HOA, someone desperate or scared, secretly reached out to Jacob. The message. It arrived one night while Jacob sat alone in his barn-turned-office. He was reviewing old water right records when his computer pinged. A new email. No name, no subject. Just a message. You don't know what they're hiding. It's worse than you think. If you want proof, meet me tomorrow. I'll only talk in person. Beneath it, a location. High Ridge Rest Stop. Midnight. Tom thought it was a trap. His ranch hands thought it was suicide. Jacob went anyway. Because he wasn't afraid of traps. He knew how to spring them. The informant. The rest stop sat on a lonely stretch of highway overlooking the valley. The wind was cold. Jacob arrived early and waited. Midnight came and went. No one. But at 12:17 a.m. a car finally pulled up. Out stepped a woman. Her hands shook. Her eyes moved fast. Afraid, but determined. June C. Arson. HOA treasurer. She didn't bother with small talk. She pressed a flash drive into Jacob's hand and looked over her shoulder like someone was watching. "I can't be part of this anymore," she whispered. "I thought it was just politics, just HOA business. I didn't know they went this far. I didn't know anyone would get hurt." Jacob didn't speak. She continued. "Marjorie is panicking. She's deleting records. Rodney hired someone to destroy evidence, physical evidence, of what they did to your well." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "You're saying they ordered it?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. "I'm saying they planned it." His jaw tightened. "Why come to me?" June swallowed hard. "Because I don't want to go down with them. And because I think you're not done fighting." She was right. The files back in his barn office, Jacob opened the flash drive. Tom stood behind him, arms crossed, silent. What they found inside would burn Riverview Meadows to the foundation. Private HOA emails planning to force Jacob off his land by declaring it contaminated. Invoices to a private contractor, paid to remove Jacob's water access. Photos of HOA board members meeting with a toxic waste hauler. A recorded Zoom call labeled Board Emergency Strategy, and on it, Marjorie's voice. "Once the well is poisoned and his land is condemned, we file eminent domain. He loses everything. No land, no water, no problem. This ends rural squatters ruining property values." Jacob paused the video. His hand closed into a slow, steady fist. They didn't just try to force him off his land. They tried to erase him. The plan. Jacob leaned back in his chair. The decision formed in his mind not with rage, but with purpose. "Tom," he said quietly, "it's time to let this story out." Tom's eyes burned. "How loud you want it?" "Loud enough they never speak over anyone again. The truth wouldn't just leak, it would flood, and every lie the HOA built would rot in it. Truth is a patient weapon. When released at the right moment, it doesn't strike. It consumes." Jacob Holton understood this. Revenge wasn't the goal. It was only the mechanic. The goal was justice. And justice, like water, always found a way. The final stage began at dawn. The exposure. Jacob didn't send the files to police first. He didn't file a lawsuit. He didn't go to the county board. Corruption this deep would only dig itself in further if warned. So he chose a different path, the one they wouldn't expect. He released everything to the people. 27 HOA members woke to chaos. Their community forums were flooded with links, emails, invoices, private meeting footage. Social media exploded across the valley. Local news trucks rolled toward Riverview Meadows like vultures toward a carcass. Hashtags lit up. Hashtag water war, hashtag HOA exposed, hashtag justice for Holton. Within an hour, the HOA emergency hotline shut down. Within 2 hours, the sheriff's office confirmed an active investigation into the poisoning of Jacob Holton's well. By noon, 2 HOA board members resigned. By sundown, the war had shifted. Now Jacob had momentum. Now they were drowning. The reckoning. Marjorie Kellerman tried to disappear. As HOA president, she was the architect of the entire operation, the legal harassment, the seized land attempts, the smear campaign, the well poisoning. But when the truth came out, she released a public statement blaming miscommunication and accusing online trolls of spreading misinformation. But lies sound weak when people are thirsty. Every resident of Riverview Meadows now understood. Marjorie didn't just go after Jacob, she cost them water. She caused fines, fights, and fear. She gambled with lives. When she returned home that night, she faced a crowd waiting in her driveway, her own neighbors, holding empty buckets. That night, she finally felt powerless. Legal consequences. Investigators raided the HOA office. Boxes of shredded documents were recovered along with hidden financial records. Then came the biggest blow. Rodney, the HOA enforcer, was arrested after the sheriff traced the toxin used in Jacob's well straight back to him. He tried to claim he was just doing property enforcement. But the toxin used wasn't fertilizer, it was industrial solvent. It had to be ordered and transported illegally, and nothing was more dangerous than a guilty man trying to save himself. Faced with prison, Rodney agreed to cooperate. He named every single board member involved. He confessed it all began with a plan to seize Jacob's land because of one secret only a few knew. The same secret Jacob had been waiting to reveal. The water rights. Jacob stepped onto the stage of the Riverview County Town Hall. Cameras packed the back wall. Residents filled every seat. Even the press was forced to stand. At the center, Jacob Holton, calm, deliberate, unbroken. He didn't come here to argue. He came to finish it. He carried a thick leather ledger, worn with age. When he opened it, the room leaned forward. It wasn't just a book. It was the original County Water Charter, 1883. His family had been among the first settlers to dig irrigation channels in the valley. In exchange for building water access for new towns, the Holtons received permanent upstream rights over the valley's only river, rights that included diversion and control during any emergency. A right never revoked. A right still legally binding. Jacob had never had to use it. Until now. The room fell silent. Marjorie, seated farther back, closed her eyes. She finally understood what she had done. She didn't just pick a fight with a farmer. She challenged the man who controlled the lifeline of the entire valley. Elijah Boone, head of the county board, asked the only question that mattered. "Mr. Holton, what do you intend to do with this?" And Jacob answered with a weight that shook the room. He would restore the river access, but only under new conditions. No HOA would ever again be allowed to control water distribution. No family in the valley would go dry because of punishment, fines, or power games. Every farm would receive guaranteed shares. Every household outside HOA developments would gain priority access. And Riverview Meadows, the community that poisoned his well and tried to steal his land, would receive water again. But last. Justice wasn't revenge, it was redistribution. The fall of the HOA. The HOA dissolved within weeks. Their charter was revoked for criminal misconduct. Marjorie Kellerman and 3 board members faced felony conspiracy and environmental poisoning charges. Rodney received a reduced sentence for cooperation, but would never again work near chemicals or construction. Their property management company filed for bankruptcy. Their name became a warning. Neighbors no longer whispered about Jacob Holton. They told his story. The rebuild peace returned to the valley slowly, like snow melting into a riverbed. Jacob's well was restored. New water lines were dug with county support. His ranch, once targeted, grew stronger. He rebuilt everything they tried to destroy. But he didn't rebuild alone. People came to help. The same people who once avoided him now stood at his side. Farmers, townsfolk, even families from Riverview Meadows. They realized he had never been their enemy. He had been their defender. And when federal investigators finished their final report, they officially credited one man for preventing a full community disaster. Jacob Holton. Water found its way home. Justice did too. The final lesson. Sometimes power hides behind money. Sometimes behind laws. Sometimes behind signatures on a corporate letterhead. But real power, unchallengeable power, belongs to those who stand their ground, protect what is theirs, and do not bend to force or fear. Jacob didn't just win. He made sure no one in Riverview Valley would ever again have to fight alone. And as the river flowed past his land once more, he stood at the bank and watched the water move across, the rocks steady and relentless, just like him. Some people build fences, some people build power. Jacob Holton built legacy.